Hey folks, welcome back. This is Andy with the Poor Proles Almanac. You can find us on Spotify, iTunes, and wherever you get your podcasts. And of course, you can find us on Patreon. If you're enjoying what we're doing here and you'd like to help us cover the costs of hosting the podcasts. We don't explicitly offer any of our traditional content focused on the specific goals of this podcast to our patrons in terms of limited access or anything like that right now. Knowledge is for everyone. But we have started up a Patreon-only mini-series called The Prologues, during which we'll do some critiques on various ecological subject matters. We've also included clips of this entire series up on the Patreon as well. So, if you want to hear stuff from all of the episodes, go check it out. We've also released one episode that was asked for by popular demand for public consumption. So, that's a good place to check it out. See if you'd like to hear more. On top of this content, we've got stickers available, and we're including some footage from my farm, putting the theory we're talking about into practice. So, if you want to see what's going on over there, check out the Patreon. Any support we can get to offset our costs, we fully and wholeheartedly appreciate. We're also on Instagram and Facebook if you want to follow us over there, and we do have a Discord page for like-minded folks to chat. In this episode, we're talking with Peter Gelderloos. We chat a bit about his work, both Worshipping Power, his most recent book, as well as a book that's untitled that's coming up, focused on ecology, localization, and anarchy. In this conversation, we talk about the idea of what does democracy look like, and how does ecology play into that? Further, how can we look at how to decolonize communities while considering the challenges that global capitalism has wrought? We have a really great conversation, and unfortunately Elliot wasn't able to join us. But Peter is one of those personalities that manages to fill a conversation, and his unique perspective and his in-depth knowledge on anarchist theory, history, and being able to research has given him the unique opportunity to dig deep on this subject matter and really explore indigenous projects in a way that I don't think anyone has ever done before. So if you're interested in the book that he talks about that he hasn't released yet, we'll be including some information about it as we find out more, and we do plan on having him on after the book is released to discuss it in a little bit more detail. So hopefully you guys enjoy this conversation. So, Peter, thanks so much for taking the time to chat with us. Your book, How Nonviolence Protects the State, came out when I was in college, and it was hugely influential in my formation in my politics. So having you on now is really great to kind of see how you start to tie in a lot of those really important ecological components and some of these ideas that we've talked about on this podcast. So for folks that aren't familiar with your work, could you tell us a little bit about yourself?
I'm an anarchist. I've participated in social movements. First, where I grew up in Virginia, and since 2007, I've been living in Catalonia. First in Barcelona, and more recently in a smaller town in the same general area. So yeah, I've basically just as long as I've been able, just been participating in different social movements against capitalism, against any just all the social against the whole this whole great big machine that's just constantly
Making our life great.
yeah.
Awesome.
You know what I mean.
Yeah.
And also in the course of this, I've been writing about kind of like collective lessons from my own experiences and those around me, or research into the history of movements and stuff like that. So yeah, the first book that I wrote was How Nonviolence Protects the State. Since then, I've written another book that also criticizes nonviolence within more recent movements like Occupy, the Plaza occupation movement, the Arab Spring, the color revolutions, etc. That one's called The Failure of Nonviolence. Anarchy Works looks at a lot of examples of self-organized societies or horizontal social movements in practice. And let's see, yeah, I also did a book with AK Press, Worshipping Power, that looks at the evolution of states, how they evolve, where they come from, and also, looking at like a long history of states collapsing, states falling apart. And then and then coming back again if societies don't organize themselves effectively against that occurrence. So yeah, I tried to make writings that are relevant and useful for social struggles, but also, I'm very much interested in history and other questions. So.
Yeah, I just read Worshipping Power pretty recently. I was really interested in particular around the idea of what you called proto-agriculture, which is kind of this idea of not quite full what we think of as traditional agriculture, but also not just completely a hunter-gatherer situation where people were managing the land for the benefit of people without it being an extensive, I'm planting 10 seeds of this, so I want to harvest 10 bushels of such and such thing, which I think is a really interesting concept in that there's a passive understanding of our ability to manage the landscape without being detrimental to it. I know in the book you at least talked about a couple of examples. Is that something that you, in your research, saw across the globe, or was it kind of a localized thing?
Well, I mean, there's already the category of horticulture, of course, which historically is quite a stable practice. Like, plenty of societies, were practicing horticulture for thousands of years, oftentimes mixed with forms of hunting and gathering or herding, until they were colonized. And even today, some societies, despite colonization and the imposition of capitalism on food markets and all the rest, still carry out like horticultural practices or food forests, and, all of these other practices that don't fit into like industrialized monocrop farming. Um, Proto-agriculture, I mean, I think like if that's gonna have any meaning distinct from horticulture, maybe it's in the framework of I mean, basically, history is often fed to us as this unilineal progress that inevitably goes from A to B to C to D, and we're somewhere very far into the alphabet by now, and any people who are still at A or B, God forbid, they're just primitives who just haven't gotten with the program. And of course, that's an inherently white supremacist way of teaching history. Um, and history tends to be the history of states. People who are stateless don't matter until they appear at the margins of the states that they can be conquered. They're often successful resistance usually isn't mentioned, and the many times that state subjects, often with the help of stateless peoples at the margin of states, have overthrown states, that's kind of left out. It's kind of glossed over as like a dark ages. So basically, we're taught like, okay, Mesopotamia, agriculture, civilization, states, as though it were this very inevitable and rapid transition, when in fact thousands of years went by. Um, and so the first big changes that lead to what we would identify as agriculture. I mean, some, of course, that especially ones that are maybe harder to capture in the archaeological record would have been more than 12,000 years ago. But otherwise, we're talking about things like 12, 10,000 years ago. But really, like proto states, like societies that are developing more coercive hierarchies and more entrenched hierarchies, that's coming up between more like 4,000 years ago, 4,000 years ago, and so you have thousands of years in between. So you could look at like sort of proto agriculture as like these spaces where different innovations were spreading regarding the domestication of crops and irrigation and stuff like that, but people weren't necessarily locked in to one kind of agricultural practice that in which monocrops tended to feature. And because the state really is important there if we're going to look at monocrop agriculture and especially ecological collapse, because around the same time, in fact, really joined together in a sort of early world system, joined together through various networks of trade, you had the Indus Valley, or the Harappan civilization, around what's now Pakistan and India, and you had the one that receives more attention in Western histories, Mesopotamia. Um, it seems that with changing weather conditions and also beginnings of soil failure or lower crop productivity because of just too much intensive agriculture, like the same crops over and over again for hundreds, if not thousands of years. The Harappan civilization actually decentralized their living patterns. They changed the territory they lived in, but they also changed the way they lived from larger concentrated cities to decentralized settlements. And there's also a lot more evidence that they didn't have a state. So they were flexible. They were able to see like, oh, this isn't working out so well anymore. Let's change our strategies. Let's live in a way that's more ecologically compatible. Whereas by that point, Mesopotamia already had a state, and the soil fertility was declining because they cut down all the trees, because their irrigation system was leading to salinization. Crop yields were falling dramatically, and people weren't free to make any kind of change because they were state subjects, and the state needed an agricultural surplus to tax as the basis of its economic wealth, to feed its armies and so forth. So it actually legally required the farmers of Mesopotamia to double down on these ecologically destructive farming practices, leading to in the southern part of Mesopotamia, leading to like a civilization collapse that that basically continued until you have like a petroleum-based civilization that can basically feed people in the desert, as it were. So yeah, that's a really long answer, but I think it's relevant to what we're facing today. That states are not well suited to ecological collapse because they tend to provoke ecological collapse, and they tend to force people to continue the exact behaviors that caused the crisis.
Yeah, that sounds about accurate. It's an interesting idea that by consolidating, you would think the ability to consolidate power and resources would effectively provide the means to do things correctly, but it never really ever plays out that way. That's kind of, I guess, my personal biggest concern is that we're ill prepared for what's coming. As a farmer who knows a lot of people, and like, I have animals, and we're already looking at in May severe droughts, cutbacks. A lot of farmers are already culling animals that they wouldn't otherwise cull because they can't afford to feed them and water them. There's already warnings of hay shortages, and like that happens, but never this early. And I feel like I'm constantly saying like all of this is like the preamble. Like this is, in 10 years, we're going to look back at what we're doing right now and say, man, those times are easy. And right now we're thinking, this is weird. This is a hard year. And in the future, we're going to look back and just be like, if we'd only known how much worse it was going to get. That's the thing with like agriculture, is it's a compounding system that you don't feel the reverberations, and the reverberations tend to be much stronger than that initial impact. And that's been kind of a driving force in trying to articulate a meaningful platform, for me at least, on the left, of saying, okay, we need to start thinking about, like, if we all agree that capitalism is doing all these awful things and that it's unsustainable, then what are we planning to do afterwards? And that's where people start to get, I think, a little uncomfortable, is trying to have that conversation. But I think you've done a really good job of that in a lot of your work. And that brings me to your new book that you're working on. I know you don't have a name for it yet, but I know you've been working hard on it, and it ties a lot of these ideas together. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's an attempt to approach the ecological crisis in an anti-colonial and anti-capitalist framework, and so that means doing a lot of specific things when talking about the problem and talking about potential solutions that usually aren't done in all of the literature that's being churned out about the problem, largely from academics or like some celebrity activists in the mix, and then in addition to economists and people connected, to the agricultural industry, bankers, whatever, like people who are often very, very close to the problem, to put it politely. So first off, it's not reducing it to climate change. The world is an incredibly complex, interconnected being, and things like habitat loss and extinctions and human migrations and changing human social models are all tied together with questions of greenhouse gas emissions, global warming, and the ability. Global warming is already here, And so there's also the huge question of living communities' resilience to global warming. And so resilience means migration, for example, of both human and non-human species, which means borders come into the mix. Resilience also means that the people who most intimately know a territory and the people who have developed methods of feeding themselves in a territory in a way that gives life to that territory rather than sucking it dry and pumping the water full of polluting chemicals, need to be front and center and need to have the power to practice those methods, to deploy that knowledge, to share it. And so that connects directly to decolonization, to supporting indigenous peoples getting their land back, not just decolonization as the newest buzzword that all the academics are putting in their writing, paying a little bit of lip service, but not actually talking about the abolition of settler states, not actually talking about getting physical land back to indigenous communities, certainly not talking about the many indigenous people who are in prison for fighting, for resisting, and other forms of repression, from man camps to the various forms of delegitimization that happen in in the academy and the official producers of knowledge, the media, and so forth. So yeah, it's a complex issue. So treating it like a complex issue and not falling into climate reductionism. It also means really challenging the official narratives and like the official forms of knowledge about the problem. So, for example, not accepting the dichotomy between humans and nature. Humans are a part of nature, whether we want to be or not, and acting like we're not has led to serious problems. And that it's a failed philosophical framework that needs to be abandoned. Also, industrial agriculture and from there capitalism. These are failed systems. Like it's ridiculous to continue talking about them as like, well, like this is really successful. Like industrial agriculture, like it's real. It exists. It's implanted across the globe, but it has failed and it's in its death throes. And just because for now, enough people, according to whose criteria also is a big question, enough people are getting fed by this, doesn't take away the fact that it's failed, that it's destroyed soil all over the world, that it's created dead zones in the oceans and lakes of the world, and that while we continue to have food surpluses around the world, you still have tens of millions of people without adequate food. So it's a failed system, and we just need to be realistic about that rather than continuing to play footsie with the various governments, with see if this oil company or that chemical company will go green and clean up their image, so we can also get invited to the various climate summits along with the NGOs and all the rest. Like that's just, it's ridiculous, and I'd say it's suicidal. Like not recognizing what are the structures and institutions that are responsible for the problem, continuing to dialogue with them and to grant them that legitimacy, and then not looking at all of the very real struggles that exist all over the world on every continent, that are incredibly intelligent, that have real answers, and whose only limitation, whose only obstacle is the repression they face. The fact that when we fight for the defense of the earth, and not nature is some distant separate concept, but the earth that we're a part of, and fight for our own healthy place in it, we get labeled as terrorists. We get locked up in jail. In a lot of countries around the world, they're straight up death squads or military or private armies that are hired by oil companies will bomb villages and kill people. And then on the other hand, you have NGOs that help legitimize that kind of repression in a way by silencing the competitors who use actual direct action, who are talking about empowering communities, taking back their land and feeding themselves without the need for charity, without the need for spokespeople going to Paris or Copenhagen or whatever to speak for them at some global conference. And I mean, one thing that I kind of like. Do you mind these really long answers? Because
No. I mean, I'm like taking notes. I'm like taking notes because I've like there's so many things you said that I want to unpack, but like keep going.
Okay, great. So one thing that I kind of really was struck by in my research. So you probably know what is it? Global Witness, I think, is the name of the NGO, and there are others that count the number of land defenders killed every year. So this is a category that has some legitimacy: land defenders, people defending the land, the water, and so forth. And how many are getting murdered every year directly or indirectly by companies like Coca-Cola, Shell Oil, Nike, and so on and so forth. And there's another link to make also labor organizing, because that often actually has a direct connection through environmental racism, through the environmental impacts that poor people face, and then also all of the different forms of pollution that happen in the workplace, and the fact that a lot of the same paramilitary and repressive structures that are killing land defenders are also killing union organizers, especially in places like Colombia, um, Brazil, Bangladesh, Indonesia, really all around the world. Um, and now there's an interesting thing when you look at these reports about all the thousands of land defenders that are getting murdered around the world for these capitalist interests, or because of these capitalist interests. They'll often put in a little footnote that the numbers don't really represent what's happening in Africa, and they don't have a lot of data from Africa, and that kind of often sneaks by within this very white supremacist, anti-black, colonial mindset of Africa is like the dark continent. Like there just aren't even any NGOs in Africa, so they really can't. There's just not the information doesn't exist about those deaths, and so it's just people just kind of permit that it's just kind of left in the gray. It's just not that information, that data isn't really filled in. But in fact, I mean, there's a huge NGO implantation in Africa, and there's media all across Africa. Like when people are dying there, the deaths are being counted. But the problem, from the perspective of these NGOs doing the counting, is that a lot of territories in Africa have not yet been um, colonized adequately enough to use this sort of framework of civil society, right? So, because I mean, take Colombia. I mean, certainly not to romanticize any of the guerrilla movements there, although hands down, they're not nearly as bloodthirsty as the paramilitaries. But like in a situation like that, you do have cases where people in a village might arm themselves, or they might look for the assistance of one of these armed groups to protect them from the paramilitaries. So if one of those people gets killed, then that's not a land defender that's getting added to the list of people killed, even though the effect is the same, to allow people in the community to protect their commons, to keep the forest from getting cut down, and so on and so forth. So in certain territories in Africa, that distinction is harder to track, because these categories of civil society and the proper peaceful NGO activism, filing a petition, and so forth, hasn't been as effectively implanted as much. So, for example, if you look at the oil producing territories in Nigeria, they had their peaceful campaign back in the 90s, with Ken Saro-Wiwa and others getting executed for their activism. The Ogoni people, the Ija people, initially peacefully protesting against the immense devastation caused by oil extraction, and just getting killed. Like either the Nigerian military or private militaries that work for the oil companies, just bombing villages and opening fire on crowds with machine guns. I mean, people aren't stupid. Like everywhere it happens, they're told to be peaceful by the government that exercises this monopoly on violence. They're told to be peaceful, and when they realize that that's just a scam, that's part of how governments maintain power so they can continue to exploit us, they learn and they develop different tactics. And for example, especially the Ija regions of Nigeria, those tactics have included forming militias that directly shut down the oil industry, that kidnap these extremely high-paid European and North American oil workers and ransom them. I mean, that's direct reparations. That's getting money directly from the companies and countries that that have been exploiting them for centuries, and getting that money where it's needed. and so now, of course, the U.S. government and I think the British and Dutch governments as well have been helping with weapons and training and stuff like that to put an end to this insurgency against the oil industry, and that's meant again machine gunning crowds, bombing villages, and so on and so forth. And those people aren't counted as land defenders. So that I think also needs to be pointed out. So it's not. I mean the right wing paramilitaries and the major corporations and all that, like um, they obviously need to be um, pointed out for the butchers that they are, and as one of the main forces that's preventing these decentralized, localized solutions to the ecological crisis and to the crisis of capitalism. But we also can't forget the role that the institutional left and the NGOs and the universities and the academics play
Yeah.
in the whole crisis.
Yeah.
So yeah, so that also is in the book.
So you brought up a couple of really good subject matters that I wanted to talk about. The most, I think, so the I guess you would want to say the biometric opposite of this very physical colonialism that you're talking about. You talked about like the academy. I want to talk a little bit about that ancestral knowledge that that colonialism has worked to wipe off the earth essentially. In doing a lot of research on these indigenous farming practices and agricultural systems, if you want to call them agricultural systems, things like coppicing, pollarding, pastoralism, so much of it has been erased to the point where there's a very concerted effort to try to rediscover a lot of these practices. And to me, there's a really big problem in this whole situation. Like, it obviously is awful, but also because of climate change, going back to a lot of that ancestral knowledge might not always be the solution because the ecologies have been so decimated. The idea that we could, in an ideal world, that if everyone agreed to go back to a hunter-gatherer society or whatever, we've degraded the landscape so much that even if we meant well, the landscape couldn't handle that kind of capacity. And in the same way, in these places that we've pillaged and destroyed the ecology of, we can't just flip a switch and say we're going to do things, we're going to do things the right way. We're going to give that land back and give that stewardship back. We're in this weird place where even if that's what we try to do, I don't know if that's enough. So I kind of wanted to know your thoughts on that ancestral knowledge component and how we can pair that with the fact that these ecologies have been so decimated.
I'm not sure like which I don't feel qualified to make any kind of generalization about which territories have had their ancestral knowledges decimated.
Sure. I mean, I don't mean any specific one, but just kind of sure.
Like definitely there are places where that's the case, and that's a big problem and its own unique kind of problem. While I was doing research for the book, what I was coming across more and more were places where there are actually, from like Brazil to Venezuela to Indonesia to even here in the Spanish states, like in around the Pyrenees, where they're actually holdouts of ancestral knowledge that like anyone who grows up in the mainstream of the society will be unaware that knowledge still exists, and it's constantly being suppressed and silenced, but it is still there, and there are a lot of initiatives for recovering it. And so the other so I think that's really important to first look and see to what extent it really has been obliterated, or if it's just being silenced and pushed out of the mainstream, and then supporting it coming back. The other big point that you were raising about whether it will be enough because conditions have changed so much, that's where I think it's important to point out that these ancestral or traditional, more ecocentric knowledge systems, I think, are not symmetrical with capitalist knowledge systems, because capitalist knowledge systems tend to have an utter disregard for the territory, and they basically take a template and they impose it on the territory as though it were just like an inert space, just a map to be filled out by their own design. Whereas traditional knowledge systems tend to be more methods of dialogue. So it's not like ignore what you find and then just plant these things, but the knowledge system itself is more about dialoguing with what you find, dialoguing with the other life forms that are there, and helping them tell you what they need and what you can share and what you can create together. So I think on that level, they are in fact inherently way better suited to the fact of changing conditions, to for example desertification and habitat loss and all the rest. And one example that demonstrates that is fire suppression. So of course, out of control forest fires are a huge problem, like a major facet of climate change. They're connected to major droughts and heat waves that that are really unprecedented. And so in that sense, like it's like this kind of this new problem, like you mentioned. However, it's the ancestral systems that are proving best adapted to that. Even though they're dealing with situations that are in effect new, their methods are in fact better suited to deal with that. So that goes from restoring the ability of indigenous communities to take the lead with I really don't like the word management, but what they're calling forest management, but basically like an ecosystemic relationship with forests on the west coast of North America, generally territory occupied by the United States, where there have been catastrophic wildfires. Also, where I live in the Spanish state in Europe, in the area of the Pyrenees. Traditional pastoral techniques are making a comeback, and there's an increasing number of people, and they never completely went away. So there were some holdouts, but now it's something that's growing again, and they're using traditional pastoral techniques to make the forests healthier again. And we're in an area that's facing a lot of desertification, but they're making the forests healthier again and more resistant to the catastrophic forest fires that are going to present a huge danger over the next few decades. So I think when you consider that it's more about dialogue and adaptability and creating relationships than just kind of like a set template that you impose on the territory, I would argue that traditional knowledge systems still have a leg up.
And that points to, I think, I guess, there's this, like you said, this indigenous movement going on globally of this like reclaiming of some of these practices. And concurrently, we also have got like regenerative agriculture and permaculture that have been building, and they've really built a lot of momentum in the last couple decades. And it's almost like this right wing versus this left wing response to this, because permaculture is much more of that plug and play. The same thing with regenerative agriculture. There's this whole business model of rewarding instructors that don't do the practice versus, I think, in a lot of more indigenous practices, it's people that do the work, and there's no intent to globalize the practice, but own the local ecology in a way that only people that have experienced it can do. So is that something that you spent some time thinking about or talking about in your book or researching, like around this idea of like permaculture and how that's either been a positive or a negative effect on some of these practices?
It's definitely something I've thought about. I don't specifically go into permaculture in the book just because I was up against a word limit, and there's so many things that I wanted to deal with. And like I don't know enough specifically about the history of permaculture, like as and where it developed. I mean, my understanding is that it developed largely in Australia, which is of course a problematic country. I mean, I think you can globalize the idea of living through your relationships with other life forms, both human and non-human life forms, and realizing that they have worthwhile things to teach you. And I mean, I've known people who have benefited from learning permaculture. That's helped them kind of on that path. And then other cases where it's just the latest green business where people are selling degrees in it, or selling designs, and they are largely like coming out of like sort of imposing a kind of manual design on a territory that they don't listen to very much. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot in the gardening that I do here where I live, where I started off kind of occupying a plot of land that was very damaged from too many years of bad agricultural practices. And I've just it's kind of like curiously, I've been taking it slowly in the sense of like, I didn't go in there like the very first year, like, I'm gonna like, grow this many kilos of vegetables and become self-sufficient. But rather going, seeing what's working, seeing what's needed. So in that sense, going slow, but at the same time with this urgency of recognizing that desertification is a big problem here. And like you mentioned with where you are, like the drought already happening in May, there already being hay shortages in May. People who aren't preparing now and people who aren't learning how to feed themselves in other ways now are going to be in big trouble in 10 to 20 years. And in just I guess I've been living where I am now, like something like 6 years, 6 or 7 years since I had this garden plot that long. And just in that amount of time, I've seen really big changes to like the health of the soil, how well the soil retains water, how long that like other people who do the more conventional gardening style in the same area, in the summer when like it's really really hot, they have to water their tomatoes every day, and how I can water them like twice a week. Little things like that that can at a certain point spread and make a big difference.
Yeah,
So like, yeah, I wouldn't write off permaculture, but I would basically, just like you said, encourage people to be aware of those potential pitfalls.
sure. So, in terms of your garden, I want to talk a little bit about how we can think about utilizing our ability to grow food and utilizing that as a way to do outreach and trying to build community and trying to really provide a model of what we want the future to look like. Is that something you've been able to do with your project, or is this more of just a personal thing that you do for yourself?
A little bit. I'm working on a very small scale. It's not a huge thing. So beyond sharing with friends, it doesn't like I don't have enough fruits and vegetables coming out of there to like really bring a lot of abundance to the table, and kind of like serve as a stepping stone as like a really useful model to other people. And also one thing that's interesting is just how people have been like really like rigidly trained in like what's correct and what's not, and just how much conventional gardening will train people to like see a garden as more ecosystemic and just completely dismiss it as like oh no, that's just like a jungle, or that's all weeds or whatever, without even taking the time to find out like well actually how many tomatoes and how much squash is actually coming out of this garden versus this one that's more aesthetically pleasing to me. And that's interesting because that also came something similar anyways came up in one of the interviews I did with a comrade from Venezuela, how once like the US embargo was really intensified on Venezuela, and people were really facing this like a situation of hunger, and the news stories about the long lines outside of the supermarkets and everything like that. But at the same time, in the countryside in Venezuela, there was like a huge amount of food that people just weren't eating because it wasn't supermarket food. It basically, in like paraphrasing the words of the interviewee, it wasn't white person food. And Venezuela during the economic boom from oil exploitation was like the Venezuelan middle class was being sold this idea that that they could become white and they could become first world through these oil profits, and by living like North Americans or Europeans do, buying processed starchy white foods in the supermarkets. And so all these like amazing often like root crops and other foods that don't appear in the supermarkets, that just wasn't considered food because it wasn't white people food. So that's a huge deal and like a really big thing to consider. But so basically, the going back to your question, the example that I do want to look at is something that happens fairly often in the region where I live, where it basically capitalism and the state tend to simplify things. And so, they have a huge amount of power and resources, but there's also a lot of power that they don't have. And they tend to really lack local knowledge. On the ground, they really have to simplify things, and they're never able to access the more complex knowledge that people on the ground are able to access. And so one of the consequences of that is just how much economic schemes simplify things. They tend to focus on just a few crops in any given territory. And so where I'm living now, like in the age of the European Union, has not been identified as like a region for like major extensive olive oil production. even though the climate is perfect for olive oil, and there's thousands upon thousands of olive trees growing here, because back in the day everyone made their own olive oil, of course. So that means a lot of abandoned olive trees. So that's a project that a lot of people, a lot of different people do. There are specifically anarchist initiatives that do it, and there's just other common sense initiatives of taking over these abandoned olive orchards. If the legal owner is around, since they're not huge companies, getting in contact and making sure it's okay, maybe giving them like 1/10 of the oil or 1/5 of the oil or something. And if there's no oil around, just if there's no owner around, just doing it. Uh, harvesting the olives in November, December, pruning the trees in March, and then having like huge amounts of like basically the kind of olive oil that's like so good under the capitalist economy. Only rich people are supposed to get it, but we're talking about like poor people who just like get together and do a lot of hard work a few days a year, and then have just like a huge amount of like really high quality, healthy, non-processed olive oil that they can share throughout all their networks.
That's
And
awesome.
and so that, yeah, that's a really inspiring example that anyone can see the usefulness of, and it makes a really good argument against the current conventional way of doing things.
So my family's from Italy, southern Italy. My parents, back over there, they used to have like communes or collective style cooperatives that collected all the oil and things like that. But a lot of that was still kind of exported because it was a large government sponsored cooperative. So even though they had access to all of these things, they didn't usually see much of the benefit of it. It gets lost like a lot of those types of organizations do. That's always been my personal, like, I love olive oil, I love olive trees, grapevines. That's like my homeland. But, yeah, that's super cool. Has that been something that you've seen, as something that people have used as a way to, I guess, to use a phrase, hold an olive branch out to try to build networks with anarchists and other groups?
Well, for example, there's in Catalonia, there's an initiative of like different like what we identify as infrastructure projects, but like radical infrastructure, anti-capitalist infrastructure projects, get together and create links, create relationships, and also in a lot of cases directly share what they're creating, whether that's olive oil or things from their gardens, or you also have things like free schools and pirate radios and print shops and stuff like that. So really, all the kind of projects that allow us to create something, that allow us to materialize the ideas of solidarity and mutual aid, coming together sort of with this horizon of moving towards a gift economy. So that might be an example of what you're asking about.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. That's something I feel like in the age of the internet and social media, a little bit goes a long way. And conversely, there's a lot of articulations around the idea of trying to do, real meaningful projects, outreach, and things like that. But that stuff seems to stay on the internet and never really make it out very often. It's a really weird time right now. There's so much activity in terms of the internet, and then you've got capitalism co-opting a lot of these movements, whether it's Black Lives Matter or permaculture. Things like the ecology continue to degrade despite everyone knowing that it's a problem, and it all points to the fact that this machine just churns on no matter what we're doing, and that we're really just kind of living on borrowed time in a lot of ways. So to kind of tie all this, I guess, back together, do you think all these things are happening at once coincidentally, or do you think this is like the system subconsciously being aware that like we're over the cliff, we're like bugs, not Wile E. Coyote, we're over the cliff and still running, we just haven't looked down yet, and they know it's there? Or is this just like capitalism doing what it does and trying to co-opt even the most smallest thing?
I think capitalism systematically co-ops whatever it can, and so I think that would be happening regardless. But I think the fact that all of these crises are kind of coming to a crescendo right now is not a coincidence. Just because all of these different systems are interrelated, and I think that's how complex systems tend to change, not through like one cause of collapse or crisis and then transformation, but everything just kind of tends to shake and vibrate all together.
Sure.
and the different crises are mutually reinforcing.
Yeah. So, do you think there's a moment of bifurcation that's coming soon, or is that like still 10, 20 years down the road?
Um, I guess 10, 20 years down the road feels like soon to me. That feels like a close timeline just because of like the magnitude of the kinds of changes that are going to happen, and they could be very, very bad changes, or they could be very emancipatory changes. Uh, so I mean, I think like the global system that exists now is coming to a point where it is going to have to make major changes if it wants to survive. And like let's say like let's put it like from like now, because some of those changes are already happening, to like 50 years down the road. um but like all of it right now is like extremely relevant. Different proposals for what kind of changes capitalism and dominant state models are going to try to make are already on the table. Maybe the eventual proposal might not have appeared yet, but it's certainly being formulated, and it's a lot of its elements are already being aired. And then on the other hand, what we're going to do from below to try to write our own futures, to write our own destinies, uh, that's already definitely being prefigured. That's already being debated. Um, and unfortunately, you're going to see a lot more authoritarianism come up in social movements as people look for quick fixes. So I think a lot of like the most intelligent solutions to the crises of capitalism, of democracy, and of well, the ecology are already, at the very least in a nascent form, they're already out there, and we're at the end of 2 decades in which social movements across the world have been overwhelmingly decentralized, um, and anti-authoritarian, and that's if you know how to look at them, that's been their strength. But we're coming up on a period in which potentially quite quickly authoritarianisms will crop up in these movements, because they're going to get more resources, because the state and capitalism are always going to favor authoritarian movements that they can dialogue with, that they're more symmetrical with, over anti-authoritarian ones that are completely controlled from below. Because people are getting desperate, because it's scary to live in these times, and we're trained to think that states have some kind of magic wand that they can wave to make things better. And we know we don't have a magic wand, but we think that maybe up there they might have one.
They've got all the money, so
Yeah, I mean, which is why so many people are supporting the Green New Deal, even though the Green New Deal makes things worse. The Green New Deal and similar proposals of creating all this financing for renewable energies, they're creating a huge market for like a worldwide land grab, which is going to be the death of countless indigenous and peasant communities around the world. And it's going to mean like a huge infrastructural boom and a major mining boom, which is going to destroy more habitats, lead to a lot more extinctions. And renewable energies on industrial scale are extremely devastating. They're extremely bad for the environment, and people don't want to look at that right now because that's their quick fix.
yeah. We don't have to change the way we live. We just have to have a couple more solar panels, whatever.
So I mean, like it's urgent because it's already happening right now. Millions of people are already dying every year right now because of these crises. Like it's already here, but we're also looking at different shifts that are going to be occurring over the next century, right? So we need to take it very seriously, but that doesn't mean we need to think that we need to solve this thing in 5 years, because like the various ramifications that are rippling all throughout the globe are going to be going on in a very, very intense way for like at least the next 100 years. And everything that we do that's in the right direction is gonna help. It's gonna make things better. So nothing's futile. And again, like a lot of the solutions are already here. A lot of really amazing struggles are already stopping pipelines. They're already recovering forests, true forests, not forestry plantations, which the NGOs and the government trees are unable to distinguish between intentionally, because tree plantations are economically profitable, even though they're the exact opposite of forests. People are already recovering food sovereignty and spreading these traditional forms of knowledge about how we can feed ourselves in relation with other life forms rather than at the expense of other life forms. So it's already going on. We need to look at them. We need to support them. We need to visibilize them. Um, from the tiny house warriors in sorry for the my bad pronunciation, Secwepemc territory occupied by Canada, to people fighting against the oil industry in Nigeria, to informal settlement dwellers who build their own homes and are fighting together with their gardens against the landlords, against the police in South Africa long after apartheid has ended. But you have just the latest iterations of neocolonialism, people fighting in Indonesia against palm oil plantations, which palm oil is super useful for biofuels, green fuel source, and it's just
Yeah.
destroying the forest there. The ZAD, which stopped an airport in France and led to a proliferation of many other ZADs, many other land occupations, but that unfortunately was put to an end because people there on the ZAD they weren't just stopping an airport, they were looking at completely different ways of living, and for several years they succeeded, but unfortunately that was put to an end by those who chose to dialogue with the politicians and dialogue with the police one more time. But so there's things happening all across the world which are extremely inspiring and extremely intelligent. Um, and that the limitation, like people, academics will always come along and say, "Oh, but this can't scale up." This sure as hell can scale up if people are doing it in every community. That would be way more effective than the solar panels and wind farms and various forms of geoengineering, which will that that are being debated, which will be very profitable, but they can scale up. Their limitation is not an inherent limitation. The limitation is that on the one hand, people shoot at us or jail us when we do these things, and on the other hand, the academics come along and say this can't scale up, or they make sure that all the resources get to like a big wind farm, or
Sure.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that points to a really important thing that I don't think gets talked about enough in general on the left is that when we talk about these types of projects, we really need to understand that when we talk about saving the landscape and building these decentralized systems, that we have to understand that there's a very physical work component that comes with it. And this is something I feel like, there's this idea of like automation and like that we're going to have all this free time. And I don't think that's really the answer. And I think it in a lot of ways perpetuates a lot of the problems of our system where we're still churning materials into goods through massive mechanization, when in reality, it's these types of hands-on things that we can do working with our ecology and each other that are so important in not only saving the ecology because we're working with it with our hands and we're seeing it. Like you said, our economic system simplifies a lot of these things because of the fact that it makes more financial sense to do that and to ignore the nuance of communities and what they can offer. But we have the opportunity with our hands and our fingers and our toes to see what's going on in the landscape and to be a part of it. You had talked about the duality of humans and nature, and that humans are a part of nature. So many different communities, across the globe have historically never had a term for things like nature or town because that's like having a term for existence itself. Like there was no outside of it that they could comprehend, so why would there be a word for it? That kind of mentality I think is so important to start bringing back to these conversations. That's how we can improve the environment. And that was something you had spoken about a little bit before as well, this idea that we can either contribute to make a better environment or we can be destructive. And I think there's an assumption that our best case scenario is that we don't destroy things more. And that kind of misses the point of us within a complex system. I'm super happy to see that ecology is taking a much more meaningful place in a lot of these conversations. I don't want to pick on Bookchin, but he paints in very broad strokes about both the role of technology and mechanization and ecology in a way that I think it's helpful to get people to start thinking in those terms, but he doesn't do much more than that. And for a lot of people, that's kind of where it's like, okay, we've talked about it. We recognize that it's important, but there's so much more nuance that goes into it in terms of these ideas like complex systems. humanity in nature, the role of that indigenous knowledge in localizing these systems and looking at all these pieces that if we just look at what nature does and like how nature focuses on making things more efficient, and we can be a part of that if we're smart enough to see what our place is and to lift up the things that help further make those systems resilient. So, I'm super happy to see what's going on, the projects that you're working on. If people are interested in your work or they want to see more or hear more, I know we chatted a bit on Twitter. Do you have any other social media, or I know you've got the book coming out. Where can people find it?
Yeah, no social media besides the Twitter. A large part of my writing is available for free on theanarchistlibrary.org. And the book will should be coming out at the very beginning of next year from Pluto Press. Yeah.
Awesome. Cool. Well, Peter, thanks so much. This was great. As always, if you enjoyed this episode, please give us a review on iTunes, which heavily impacts our outreach to new listeners and helps us bring on new and exciting guests. We appreciate your support, and we hope you enjoyed this conversation.